Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event. Well, under Ben Ali's dictatorial regime, Ben Ali that you see here, when all spaces of freedom of speech started to be limited and shut one after the other, people found refuge in anecdotes and jokes. I remember one particular story that some Tunisians enjoyed to tell for the emptieth time when they were in a small group, but let me mention that one didn't dare to do so only after drinking some beers, turning the mobile phone off, and performing a circular scrutiny look to be sure of the absence of watchful foreign ears. Well, the story said that two dogs met amidst the bushes, covering the hills forming the Tunisian western border. Indeed, they were hiding there, waiting for the opportunity to sneak across the border, as they didn't have travel permits. Having a chat, the first dog, which was miserable, mangy, and not far from starving, explained that he fled eastward hoping to be able to live and eat properly. He expressed his perplexity and dismay to see the second dog, the Tunisian dog, with the shiny hair and radiant mind going to the west where there is nothing to eat. Full of self-confidence and totally determined to fulfill his quest, the second dog didn't then hesitate to confess. I am tired and sick of being silent, of being silenced. I really want to bark. This story or anecdote sums up the situation we were going through under the old regime. In comparison to the neighboring countries, we could relatively benefit from a certain material ease. Consumer products abounded if they weren't within the reach of each and every one, and even if our resources are less affluent than those of our neighbors. But we were deprived of expressing ourselves freely and at our ease. Nonetheless, as the anecdote reveals too, our willingness to express ourselves, to bark, wasn't tarnished. The reverse was the case. We invented many tricks to be able to breathe a little bit. This is how we used to call it, breathing. Solutions included resorting to irony and mockery, fleeing the country or melting into secrecy and anonymity. Life went like that till the day that all the horizons were kept to our youth, and that the explosion occurred. Indeed, the economic and social situation has gradually deteriorated because of corruption, nepotism, and the total absence of strategies of development. The repression went crescendo as the regime was losing all credibility among citizens and was completely unable to reply, even partially, through discourse and dialogue to their claims. Repression also targeted the space for dialogue, exchanges, and communication that ICTs allowed, that space where people, especially the youth, rushed to express themselves. I will spare you the story's details, but I would say that the display of the despondency was at first social, its most known illustration being the social movement of the mining area in 2008, followed by the sporadic reactions and movements of the unemployed. Then movements rejecting censorship that befell on the web like a leaden shroud, and movement claiming respect of fundamental individual and collective rights appeared. The peak of these movements had been the organization of a demonstration against censorship in May the 22nd, 2010. And then the period going from the end of 2010 to the beginning of 2011 witnessed an acceleration of all kinds of demands. their extension through regions and the rally of different categories of angry people. Then came January the 14th, 2011. Once the dictator ousted, we thought that we would inaugurate a new era made of freedom, dignity, and development. But we were quickly disillusioned by the different events and developments taking place. The phenomenal explosion of various forms of expression was quickly countered by a denial and a counterattack coming both from the forces of the old regime trying to preserve power and to preserve their status, and the political forces that the social and political explosion brought out of their hiding places or back from their exiles. These forces that were hungry for power rushed to master the course of the events and to neutralize any willingness of opposition to their plans. Thus, the walls of the capital and other cities witnessed a constant ebb and flow of colors, slogans, poems, and images. Many young revolutionaries worked on brightening the most iconic streets and squares with their graffiti, calls and demands, but all the things that they wrote, drew, or engraved were quickly deleted, erased, or simply blurred. As you can see, they are painting some graffitis. And when the bloggers wanted to pay a tribute to the martyrs of the revolution, they organized a meditation sit-in. They just sat silently around their flowers and candles. Nevertheless, they were harassed and forced to clear off under the pretext that what they were doing was in contradiction with customs and religion. This happened only a few weeks after January the 14th, 2011. Then we started to bully artists, qualified of wicked or even impious or unbelievers. Bloggers, journalists, and some faces revealed by the revolution started to receive threats, to be the victims of defamation campaigns and to be abused on the streets. With the beginning of the campaign for the election of a constituent assembly, a well-known Tunisian filmmaker, Nouri Bouzid, received death threats in a public meeting, chaired by prominent politicians. Few days after, a ceremony organized as a tribute to artists, actors, singers, and poets was attacked using gas bombs and sticks. Since then, things started to become increasingly clear. We realized and understood that we didn't win the battle of freedoms and rights. In fact, this battle has just started. This proved to be true on several occasions, in various places, and in a continuous manner, which denoted a prior orchestration. I will just list some cases. In March 2012, when a group of young artists and comedians wanted to pay a tribute to the revolution and to celebrate the Theatre International Day on Avenue Habib Bourguiba, the Avenue of the Revolution, they had to face the physical and verbal violence of hordes of people equipped with loudspeakers and waving the black banner under the knowing smile of the police. In November 2012, members of a young graffiti group, artists known as Zouaoula, and it is the Tunisian dialect for the poor, who choose to give voices to the poor of our country through beautiful drawing and slogans, were arrested, badly treated, and had to appear before a court for expressing themselves freely in a public space. Several journalists and press officers were brought before courts just for criticizing some decisions and reporting the citizens' claims. Peaceful demonstrations and sit-ins were either banned in advance or savagely repressed. This happened on several occasions in 2011, 2012, and 2013. The Troika's government, dominated by the fundamentalists, had even tried to ban all demonstrations and rallies on Avenue Habib Bourguiba. It is, of course, the same avenue that witnessed the most determining moments of our revolution. That same government erected a fence outside the government palace to prevent any attempt to reoccupy the iconic place of Al-Qasba by the crowds. In Bardo, a venerable shrine of sovereignty as it hosts the headquarters of the assemblies, that of the Constituent Assembly, then now that of the representatives of the people, banners, signs, and notices were torn, ripped, and trampled so many times. Sit-ins in which were taking part political party leaders, members of organizations and associations, as well as deputies, were scattered using tear gas and truncheons. Several bloggers were harassed for sharing statuses on social media or pieces of information on social networks. I will mention, for example, Ali Abidi, a young blogger from Regab Sidi Bouzid, where the revolution started and who was the victim of several false accusations and arrests. Rappers and comedians were harassed too. Lotfi Abdelli, the author and the actor of a widely popular Tunisian one-man show, was deprived of the police protection during his shows by a decision of the police trade unions just because of his outspoken and harsh criticism of the abuses of the police. In August 2013, policemen interrupted a rap concert performed in an international festival, thus a public one, that of the seaside city of Hammamet, and I will stop here to invite you to visit the city to enjoy its settings, tourist facilities, and its exquisite charm. They indeed went on stage in the middle of the show, arrested the two rappers that you can see, Klaybi BJ and Wald Elkans, led them handcuffed to a police station before accusing them of defamation against the security forces. Later on, the justice acquitted them. 1 year earlier, Wald Elkans, on the right of the photo, had been arrested and condemned to 2 years in prison for defamation against the security forces because of a song criticizing the police. And when many young people, including underground artists, showed their support to him, they were victims of the violence of the police, even inside the court. Other music and street art groups were bullied and harassed, including Fanni Raghman Anni, which means my art despite myself, as well as alternative spaces like the Theater Massar and Al-Louh Cafe that had been obliged to keep their drapes shut for a while. On social networks, all practices like censorship, defamation, and hijacking are clearly present again. But what is new is the fact that it is no longer clear who is directly responsible for such acts. Are they public authorities? Are they officers depending on certain political parties? Or are they both of those groups? Moreover, the media landscape has been taken over by the authorities and the different parties dissatisfied with the advance of the revolution, as well as by different occult forces that are managing to manipulate public opinion through bludgeoning and the evocation of everything that scares. Public media have been progressively deprived of the most impartial and independent presenters who showed competence. This was the case of RTCI, Radio Tunis International Channel, for example. Many private TV channels have emerged and have been recalcitrant to the directives of the High Authority of Audiovisual Control. Many newspapers, owing their existence to the revolution, have proven to be experts of disinformation and manipulation. Now, and after the multiplication of terrorist acts, the Tunisian media landscape seems to be the object of a knowledgeably orchestrated manipulation campaign based on the exploitation of fear. This campaign seems to be led by forces conspiring to restore the old regime, including some members of the security forces, as well as rising extremist forces acting under the cover of religion, and who consider democracy just as a path to have access to power. Indeed, every evening, Tunisian public opinion is bludgeoned by shows and displays accusing human rights defenders of laying the ground for terrorism. They also present human rights both as a luxury and as a danger. They moreover justify the persistence of torture and the disrespect of the right to defense and to fair trial under the cover of emergency and priority. Shouting the slogan, "Freedom against security," seems to become an acceptable gesture. Thus, the violence targeting journalists a few weeks ago who rushed to cover the aftermath of the terrorist attack of November the 24th, 2015, has been justified by the stress and the grief of the security forces members. This means that freedom of expression is not fulfilled yet, or at least is far from being definitively acquired in my country, unfortunately. If you come to visit Tunisia and take the time to discuss with people, and precisely with the youth, you would definitely hear such reflection as, "We didn't succeed in fulfilling the most important objectives of the revolution, but we had at least succeeded in obtaining our freedom of speech and expression. The restoration of the old regime is looming on the horizon, but they will never succeed in depriving us from our freedom of speech. It is true that claims and demands of dignity and access to employment are far from being achieved. Nevertheless, freedom is once for all acquired, or at least freedom of speech." And those who know the anecdote, the story of the two dogs that I have mentioned in the beginning of my presentation would tell you, now at least we dare and can bark. The most experimented would even tell you that they feel extremely bewildered because Ammar 404, and it is the name that we used to give as bloggers and cyber activists to the censor. So that they feel extremely bewildered because Ammar 404, the internet censor under the old regime, is back to the Ministry of Interior. He even got a promotion after hiding for almost 5 years. I don't want to be neither negative nor pessimistic, so I will allow myself to take a few more minutes from your time and tell you that following the ouster of the dictator, Tunisian youth called for a second republic, and thus to the drafting of a new constitution. Indeed, they were dreaming and believing that it was possible to live in a country that would respect both the individual and collective human rights, and that it would be a democracy walking towards progress and development. Nonetheless, we were rapidly disillusioned. The majority of our legislators and the state machine and government that they succeeded in mastering wanted a new constitution too, but they were longing for a new constitution that is more repressive, retrograde, and freedom-destroying than the old one. They wouldn't recognize the supremacy of the international law and the necessity of including international standards in the new constitution and the new laws that would implement it in practice. They wanted to use the reference to the Quran, the Sharia, as the main source of legislation and law, and dreamed of establishing a caliphate state recalling the Wahhabi one. For them, women are the complements of men and not their equals. Yes, they wanted to include that in an article of the Constitution. Freedom-loving youth and outraged women, feeling that their required rights were threatened started to mobilize. Several marches and demonstrations, as well as two important and big sit-ins, were organized. Democrat and progressive representatives of the Constituent Assembly joined the movement, and the powers that had interest in avoiding a social or political explosion agreed to have some kind of consensus that unblocked the situation. You certainly know the story with the happy end, that of the Tunisian Peace Nobel Prize, and Tunisia is receiving the prize right now in Oslo. Nevertheless, this is not the point I want to make here. I would just say that thanks to the resistance of our women and youth, we have been able to outsmart the tricks of the obscurantists and to pledge for a relatively modernist constitution. I am saying relatively because several of its articles include ambiguities. I will list certain provisions in relationship with freedom of speech. The Article 31, freedom of opinion, expression, media, and publication. Freedom of opinion, thought, expression, information, and publication shall be guaranteed. These freedoms shall not be subject to prior censorship. Article 32, access to information. The state guarantees the right to information and the right of access to information in communication networks. Article 21, equality before the law. All citizens, male and female, have equal rights and duties and are equal before the law, without any discrimination. The state guarantees freedoms and individual and collective rights to all citizens, and provides all citizens with the conditions for a dignified life. Article 42, culture. The right to culture is guaranteed. The freedom of creation, expression is guaranteed. The state encourages cultural activity and creativity and supports the strengthening of national culture, its diversity and renewal, in promoting the values of tolerance, rejection of violence, openness to different cultures, and dialogue between civilizations. The state shall protect cultural heritage and guarantees it for future generations. And the second article of our constitution is about the civil state. Tunisia is a civil state based on citizenship, the will of people, and the supremacy of law. This article might not be amended. It is true that it's moving for me to read those articles. It is true that I have a feeling of pride and satisfaction. Nevertheless, I will allow myself to undeceive you. As to the reality of things, it is true that we have succeeded in including rights and freedoms recognized by the entire humanity in our constitution. But until we see their fulfillment in real life, the way is still too long. Indeed, we are still undergoing the old regime's repressive and freedom-destroying laws, as our parliament is too reluctant to modify them in order to bring them in conformity with the new constitution's provisions. Moreover, certain laws and bills that were recently enacted or reviewed are entirely contradictory with the constitutional provisions. I will conclude by saying that while we are celebrating the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet, and while we are on the point of celebrating the 5th anniversary of the revolution, we are still far away from having secured the only true and crucial acquired right of the revolution, namely freedom of speech. Nevertheless, our youth have always showed that they are the masters of their destiny and fate, and that they would keep on fighting to fulfill their goals. And I finish by some thoughts to these two Tunisian journalists kidnapped in Libya for more than 1 year now, and our government did nothing to know where they are. And this also a Tunisian woman that had been kidnapped last week in Yemen, and nothing. And yeah, thank you for listening to me. These are my Facebook page, my Twitter account, and my blog. You can find more about human rights and freedom of speech. And you can also read my book, Tunisian Girl. There is a Swedish version of it. Thank you very much.